are in the English channel. The person who's helping us today is Marceli. Thank you for your help. And in the Spanish room, we have Larissa. And as guests, we have Ana Carolina Amaral, Alice Martins, and Claudio Angelo. Before we begin for real, I'm just going to get my script just because I need to remember to say a few things. Good evening to everyone. Thank you for being here Wednesday evening. I know everyone's tired because this week has been so hectic. Those of you who are watching the recording, I hope you enjoy it. I'm Daniel Nardine. I live in one of the 9 capitals of the Brazilian Amazon. Belém isn't the only capital. It is one of the capitals of the 9 states of the Brazilian Amazon. I'm the director of Amazonia Vox. Please access our website and check out our information, our sources, and our freelance network. That could be really helpful if you're looking for sources in the Amazon or seeking partnerships. Well, this is our 5th session. So next week we'll have our 6th session and our last session. And this work is a partnership between Amazonia Vox and the Knight Foundation for Journalism in Latin America. And our project of coverage of COP30 has sponsorship from Itaú, and we thank the Environment Organization of Colombia for the translation. Today we have Claudio Angelo, Alice Martins, and Ana Carolina Amaral. Now we're going to pass on to Claudio Angelo. He's going to do a presentation, then Carolina, and then Alice Martins. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box. So to present Claudio Angelo, if you don't know him, you might know him from social media. Claudio, please leave your social media channels because they're so great. He is a journalist by the University of São Paulo. He's received a grant and studied in Massachusetts. He is a coordinator at the Climate Observatory and is the author of The Death Spiral: How Humanity Changed the Climate Machine, a winner of the 2017 Geology Prize. Claudio, this is a very brief summary of your career. You've been following Copy for a long time. Have you been in all of them? I'm going to my 15th COP, if I'm not mistaken. But at my age, we stop remembering things clearly. So I am sharing your presentation, and I remember a quote, but Claudio Angelo is the type of guy who, well, first video that Claudio recorded, he said, "I said I wasn't coming back, but here I am. Please don't take me seriously. Good evening. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. I have a lot of slides, but not all of them matter. So I just want to say what's going to happen in November this year. I'm very anxious about November 24th, which is the day that copy ends. I am living for that day. Copy is coming home. This is an international convention that was signed in 92 in the Rio Earth Summit, and it has a curse. It is cursed. The first signature, the first name on it, on the climate convention, was Fernando Collor de Mello's, and that explains why the UN climate conferences are haunted. It's because former President Fernando Collor was the first to sign it. And so the convention has as its goal to avoid the the risky interference of humans on the climate, and some say we failed at that, but it is signed in 92, is implemented in 94, and then COPs started happening in 95. The first one happened in Berlin, and it was presided by Angela Merkel. See how young she looks. And Berlin adopted a mandate to implement the second article of the convention, which says, let's cut emissions to avoid cooking the planet. And then COP3 in Japan, in COP3 in Japan, we produced an instrument called the Kyoto Protocol. And my slides are all messed up because I made them in Canva. And the Kyoto Protocol divides countries in annexes, and so some countries in Annex 1 have to cut emissions, countries in other annexes aren't required. And so some countries, notably the United States, do not feel comfortable, and so they leave the Kyoto Protocol because they don't want to meet the requirements, considering that China wasn't implicated. I'm sorry I'm speaking so fast. I'm just giving you a really fast overview of the history so that we can talk about today. So Copenhagen was a failure, and Paris adopts a universal instrument by which all the countries are required to do something, but the way in which they will do this thing is voluntary. So you are required to meet targets, but you do it in the way that you think is best. And that leads to all sorts of mess because, for example, some countries might say, oh, I'm not going to have an absolute target. And so these applications they become very confused, very messy. But this agreement is good in a way because it's universal. If we had time, the Paris Agreement would be fine, but we don't have a lot of time to operate within these beautiful rules set in the Paris Agreement. I'm not going to summarize the Paris Agreement, but we do have the target of reducing the temperature. And then now we reach our copy. We have ended the phase of negotiations, and now we are in the phase of implementation. We are not sure how Brazil intends to do this implementation, but there are some cards on the table, and one of them is the cause of global warming, the main cause, which is fossil fuels, and how we're gonna deal with that. So how does it work? How does a conference actually work? Rui Costa, the minister of the civil house, he has not understood this yet, but this is not a Brazilian conference. This is a UN conference that Brazil is hosting. And so when you enter the formal space of COP, you can only get in if you have a badge. You are not in Belém anymore. You are in this neutral space, you're following the UN rules. The official languages are the UN languages. And so Brazil cedes this space to the UN, and it's called the Blue Zone. The Blue Zone is where the new negotiations happen, where diplomats, ministers, and the press circulate because that's where the news happen. Beyond the Blue Zone, and also managed by UN, you have the Green Zone, where companies, civil society organizations organize events, cocktails, concerts, all sorts of things. You don't need a special badge to get in. And I was in Belém last Friday, and from what I could see, Belém is going to turn into a big green zone because there will be all sorts of people organizing all types of activities. Two theaters in the city are going to host a series of debates. And so there's a wealth of activities and events that will be so cool for journalists to check out because not everyone can get credentials to get into the Blue Zone. And to be frank, not everyone has a patience to follow these very lengthy formal discussions. The credential process is already open. I'm not sure if it has officially opened for the press yet, but the badges have different colors depending on the types of secrets that they unlock. So the red badge is the one that gives you access to the biggest secrets, the biggest gossip, the hottest news. Then you have the pink badge, which are for delegates, and if you get that, you can follow the negotiation tables. The pink bag itself has divisions. You have the blue badge for multilateral organisms. The yellow badge is for observers who participate in some negotiation tables, but not all of them. And then the orange one is the worst of all, which is the one for journalists. Basically, you can only walk around the hallways, the press rooms. I have less than a minute. I'm not gonna talk about the coverage cycle, but basically, COP begins with the heads of state making political statements in Belém. Uh, the gathering of leaders is going to happen before. And on the second week, the negotiations are still happening in slow motion, but that's when you have a lot of news because beyond the heads of state, you'll have celebrities, scientists. So the Blue Zone has been very hectic in the first week. And even from in the negotiations, you have Carol is going to talk more about this, but there are agreements that usually happen toward the end are now starting to happen at the beginning. And so the first week has a lot of news. The third week is the second week is when the ministers come and we start seeing negotiations ending. People start going home. It starts getting easier to circulate. Sometimes you're even able to find plugs and the internet gets faster, but the food continues to be bad. To conclude, I'm I've gone beyond my time already, but stay cool, please calm down, take your time. Anyway, here's what I learned. What kills a journalist during COP is the excess of distractions. Everyone's trying to sell you a story, and 90% of what people are trying to sell is crap. So be selective with what's presented to you. I'm talking about the blue zone. The spaces for journalists are hallways, press conferences. When when I was a regular journalist, I would go to the press conferences to see who I wanted to catch in the hallways afterward. Use the first week to map out the space. It's important to know where you're going because it's a very big space. It's easy to get lost, and I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. Sometimes you lose a story because you're not able to be in this physical place where you're required to be at a certain time. And I think there's something about understanding what is the main issue, the main conflict of COP. Every COP has one big conflict that persists until the end of the conference. In Paris, it was the question of differentiation between countries, and in Berlin, unfortunately, the conflict is logistics. Will there be accommodation for everyone? Will it be an empty cup or not? I think, unfortunately, this is going to be a problem, and that's going to persist for the following 2 months. And finally, be helpful with your colleagues. You will not get an exclusive at COP. So cooperation between journalists makes everything better. You're always going to need somebody to give you a lead, a tip, because you can't be everywhere at the same time. And so this fraternity, this sorority among journalists is very important, and I'd like to see everyone practice it, although it's easy for me to say this now because I'm no longer a journalist. If you think you know what's happening, it's because you don't understand anything. It's healthy to be confused. Here are some links for some helpful sources. Daniel can share this with you later, and that's it. 3 minutes beyond my time. That was excellent, Claudio. This presentation, I can get it from Canva and fix it for you, and then those who are interested can download it. We have a question for Claudio, but I'm gonna save it to the end. Sometimes I call her Anna, sometimes I call her Carol. How do you like to be called? You can call me Carol. So Carol is a journalist with a degree from UNESP, and she has a master's degree in holistic sciences from Schumacher College. She was an environmental reporter for the Folha de São Paulo newspaper, where she wrote the environment blog. She has been covering COPs since 2015 and other environmental diplomacy conferences. She contributes to publications such as Global News, Epoca, and others. Carol, where are you now? And what are your plans for this COP? Thank you, Daniel. So I apologize for the lighting and for the connection. For now, the internet's stable. I don't know if this connection is safe at all, but I am in the national park in the French Guiana, which borders Amapá. It's a partnership between Folha de São Paulo and Climate Home. I'm transitioning from Folha to a climate organization, and we are going to cover COP in partnership with other outlets, but with a unique perspective. And I've been covering COPs since Paris, um, with a behind the scenes perspective. But I'm very enthusiastic about COPs. I like to see the entire world just close together, discussing text in English, which is nobody's native language. And my focus for COPs, and most of them I covered for Folha, was negotiations. And this coverage was for a daily newspaper. And I've seen the coverage increase over time. We've gained physical space in the newspaper. So, what I wanted to share with you is the dynamics of negotiations, how it's been for me, although I understand that this needs to be adapted to the interest of the outlet because not everyone covers COP the same way. When I was in Folha, the focus was national. So I was following the Brazilian negotiators, understanding what were the big agenda items. Now I'm writing some articles for Climate Home, and that's another focus. And what I usually share is that us journalists, we're outsiders. We tend to stay in the hallways. I follow a lot of things online as well, but the spontaneity of the hallways is what gives me the most information about what's being plotted. So I'm gonna share a little bit about my routine covering COP. If your focus is negotiations, what I think is interesting is to follow the bulletins, the Earth Negotiation Bulletin, which gives you a brief of the main negotiations of the previous day, and also this other um, uh, sort of newsletter written by multiple NGOs. So my focus are negotiators, legislators. There was one negotiation, a preparation for a negotiation regarding biodiversity that for some reason, I'm not sure if it was a security breach, but we journalists were able to get in. So I saw what observers see, and I share this in Belay, and I want to share with you as well. The negotiations are basically people editing text. So they have this giant Word document, they project it on a big screen, and you have all these people sitting around the table, and negotiators are like, "Hey, where it says should, it should be must. Where it says can should be should." And so each thing is put into brackets, and throughout 2 weeks, over the course of 2 weeks, the goal is to reduce the number of brackets, and these 2 weeks can lead to some good stories. And I think I've made some mistakes where I wrote an article about a process that was still being cooked and that could change at any minute. And in the anxiety of taking a photo, sometimes you take a photo and it means nothing 6 hours later. And so you have to be discerning when making photos. Cop begins with uh, an agenda, and throughout the first week, you have technical negotiations. It's hard to have news on the first week. And then, as Claudio said, it's interesting to use this first week to go to parallel events, and you have to be very selective because there are all these associations, all these lobbyists, and they show up with their green slogans, and it's good to be discerning. You should do your research and learn who is worth talking to, what organizations are worth paying attention to. So just use the first week to get information about these parallel events and also political declarations. There's all these politicians saying things. I think there's a culture of the first and second day, you have a bunch of political declarations. 100 countries commit to, or they pledge to do one thing. In the beginning, I thought this was complicated to write about because it gave readers the impression that we had arrived somewhere. But it's it's hard because you don't know, like, who do you what do I do with these declarations? They're so superficial, they're so empty. But in Dubai, I thought it was interesting because the political statement was almost like a viability test on what could go into the final text. And so in Dubai, we had a pledge to triple the amount of renewable energies, and these signatures mobilized support, and it did make it to the final text. So it's worth observing this political movement and how it influences the final negotiation text. And just to finish the cycle of coverage that Claudio summarized so well, you have the technical negotiations, you have these political statements, and then you have a meeting on the first Saturday to kind of summarize what happened that week. And this is an interesting opportunity to see what each country is saying. And then on the second week, the ministers come, and then the negotiations take on uh, a political quality. There's great expectations. When does the second draft come out? And then you realize these drafts don't mean anything. But at that moment, the following draft is a big deal, and it's what gives us a sense of whether negotiations are advancing or not. So the second week has more informal negotiations. So we're in the hallways much more because everything happens behind closed doors, but there's more drafts coming out. more movement, and it's very delicate to cover because things change all the time. People see COP as this organized event and they think that everything's planned ahead. And some conferences are like that. Diplomats will be negotiating throughout the year, and then they get to the conference and they just kind of formalize what they already decided. But COP isn't like that. It's a very last minute thing. Things can change at any moment. Sorry if I've gone over my time. You've been looking at me for a long time, but I just got excited. Thank you. I've made some notes here, but are you going to stay with us? How is your connection? Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to give the floor to Alice. Alice, do you have a presentation? Yeah, let me see if I can share it. While you prepare your presentation, Alice, for those who don't know her, she's a freelance journalist specializing in science communication. She's a special reporter at Amazonia Vox. She has participated in the she worked in a series of projects, and she received a fellowship in 2022. And this year, she is working, and we're working together. We received a grant from the Pulitzer Center. It's about artificial intelligence, degradation in the Amazon, seedlings, and climate change. It's an exciting combo. Alice, you have the floor. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Daniel. It's an honor to be here with Claudio and Carol for references to me. And it's in the title of the event, How to Translate Climate Speak. And I highly recommend Claudio because he can talk about the climate in a way that's very simple and dynamic. And as Daniel introduced me, I'm not going to introduce myself. I just wanted to cover tips on people who are going to using my personal experience. I don't have vast experience, but I think that's where I can help because Claudio and Carol have so much experience that I can provide that perspective with somebody who's starting now. I covered COP27 in Egypt with Daniel, and in terms of climate negotiations, I also covered a conference in South Korea. And these two experiences were really important to me. And here is what I would have liked to receive as advice. First, you need to know what your focus is. There's a lot happening. When we talk about climate change, that's an entire universe. It includes so many topics. So it's useful to know what exactly you want to cover. Are you more interested in forests? Maybe are you interested in a perspective of gender? And it's important to understand who your audience is so you can know what topics might interest them. What is really interesting about climate is that it affects everything. If you're a health journalist, if you're a gender journalist, economics, politics, everything has to do with climate. So you can cover all angles from multiple angles. And just like Carol said, she wrote for a daily newspaper. Not everyone is interested in that. So you have to identify what is interesting to you at that moment. I used to work for a local newspaper, and these this general information about negotiations, sometimes these local regional newspapers, they partner with the national newspapers, and they already get these articles. And so it's important to know exactly what you're looking for. Something I like doing when I go to a conference like this is to plan special stories. For example, when I went to cover the plastics treaty meeting in South Korea, there were some news that I wanted to write, and I started working on them beforehand. I was focused on the connection between the Treaty of Plastics and the Amazon. So, for example, I knew that there were bird nests with plastic in them, and that was the story I started working on before going to the conference. And in our case, especially talking to people from the Amazon, we have a duty to study. We complain a lot, and we are right to complain about the stereotyped coverage of the Amazon and how it reinforces certain aspects that we prefer to not have emphasized. So we who are from the Amazon, we have a responsibility to study a lot and do really good coverage. I can share this with you, um, some resources, what I use to study, and it's hard, but I do devote some of my time every day to studying for COP because every day there's something new. One of them is the COP Central newsletter. The second one is a newsletter by Giovanna Girardi. These 2 newsletters, the first newsletters talks about coffee, whereas the second talks about climate in general. If you like podcasts, I love podcasts because then I can listen while I wash the dishes. 2 podcasts I recommend are Entrando no Clima and Las Niñas. They do this entire work of simplifying what is being talked about globally. And another tip is if you're covering COP and your focus isn't the negotiations, you still need to know what's being talked about, even if you're not going to write about it specifically. You have to have an overview. And so what I did, I even did this while at coffee, at the end of the day, I would listen to the podcast because the host would give me that overview of the day. So in my case, I was covering Brazil topics and the Amazon consortium topics. And then by the end of the day, I didn't know what had happened in the in the space of diplomats. And so I listened to the podcast so that I could get to know what happened in a general sense. I'm almost done. If you've never been to Belém, or if you've never been to, you probably heard this before, but I'm going to emphasize it because it's so important. Use comfortable, light clothing, and take a light jacket because inside the conference will be cold, but when you go out to lunch, it will be very hot. So comfort is essential in a journey like this. An umbrella is indispensable because it's either very, very sunny or it rains. Some handkerchiefs, or because you will sweat a lot. A charger, because depending on where you will be, there won't be plugs. And same with internet. When the day Lula arrived, it was chaotic because there was no internet. No one had internet at Copy. So if you are working on an article, make it so you can work offline, save your files, have different SIM cards because a few minutes without internet can make a difference. And I also recommend that you talk to sources from the Amazon. So diversify your sources, especially if you're from the region. It's nice to talk to these very important researchers, people who we don't see in our day to day, but it's also a time to appreciate the sources that are local, not just as characters, but as trusted sources. And Amazonia Vox has this database of sources that you can use for that. I didn't ask her to do that, so thank you. And I wanna talk a little bit about that. We have all these questions in the chat. Marissa Noguchi is backstage helping us, but about this database of sources, we have 1,200 sources in the Amazon. You can search by topic or name. For example, if you search for climate, you will find indigenous leaders, people who work in civil society organizations. And so this is a free tool that can be very helpful. Claudio, I'm going to ask you two things. You said in at the beginning about how the Denmark Cup was a failure because of Denmark. Denmark is a serious country. How did it cause a failure in negotiations? And why should we pay attention to that? Luciani asked for tips as a first-time goer to COP. I think we covered that. And Georgie asked the fact that the next copy is happening in Brazil, if that is if that somehow is going to change how the conference happens. As Zeca Pagodinho says, you gotta know how to sing. And the president did not know how to do that. It matters who the president is, who the COP president is. It's kind of like the head of the Senate. You have a lot of power. For example, the Berlin Mandate was only possible because there was a competent person in power who was Merkel. You had 9 countries at the end raising signs. It was at the last minute, the most tense minute when everything can change or sink, and Merkel breathed deeply and she hit the hammer, and You have to be flexible, you have to be willing to break rules or change perspectives. In Copenhagen, beyond the Danish president not being competent, they betrayed Africa in the first week. There was a document, a draft produced by the president, and it leaked to The Independent in the UK, and it was a document that had the vision of these developed countries, and that caused trust to crumble, and everything was lost. At one of the final sessions, the guy who nowadays is a foreign relations minister, he was about to hammer at the end, and somebody held his hammer because Venezuela intervened, and that intervention from Venezuela and his hesitation made it so the Copenhagen Agreement, it made it not work. Here, for this topic, we have an experienced and a diplomat who's a specialist in climate. He knows everything he needs to do, and this it does not guarantee success. Delaying is happening in the worst geopolitical context since 92 or maybe since 45. I know I'm being controversial here. I won't go into detail, but the president makes a difference. And then tips for first time goers, I think Carol and Alice cover that. If the fact that it's happening in a democratic country makes a difference. Yes, if people can see that. We can't guarantee. We know that LA won't be as inclusive as we would all like because of this issue of cost. There's a lot of people who are giving up because you have 3 months to plan a trip and you have all these logistical problems. I think this will naturally prevent people from going. That said, of course, it makes a difference having people protest on the streets. Of course, it makes a difference. And here we complain about the government every single day. Civil society criticizes the government every day. And I think something that can hinder the Brazilian presidency is their transparency. Everyone knows where they're going, what they're doing, and this spoils people. You give people a hand, they want your entire arm. And so it does make a difference, the fact that COP is happening in a democracy. But again, people have to be willing to come. Who is the president? It is André Correia do Lago, an ambassador, and we have a vice president as well. Let me get Carol. We have a question for her. There, I think it was Gabriel who asked, people are asking, freelancers, they don't work for a particular outlet. So how do you get a credential? What if you don't work for a particular news outlet? Some people try to sell a story after they've been to the conference. This is easy. The credentials are harder to get if you come from a conservative organization. They actually welcome press attention. So all you need is a letter from an editor. This is something you can negotiate with editors. You can say, it's not a commitment. You don't need to buy my story. It's just a manifestation of interest in a potential story. I recently, at the Plastics Treaty meeting, I got a letter from the Agência Pública. Um, they understood that, you know, I was I'm a freelancer. I write stories for different outlets. What if you don't have a letter from an editor? There's you do need the letter. You need to have some links to your portfolio, to show that you have experience. You need links and you need a letter. With small outlets, it's easier to get. And I suggest, as Claudio suggested, some outlets can't send their team, and then somebody will say, "I'll be there, and you give me a letter." I think that's the way to do it. Now, the news outlets have, more interest, but in the past, I went in very precarious situations, and I'd get an email from an editor who would say, "Hey, is COP starting tomorrow? Can you cover it for us?" And so this happens frequently. You know, news outlets that don't have a lot of experience covering climate, they give you a last minute opportunity. But it's worth having a letter in hand, and then you can negotiate last minute. I'm gonna ask you another question. I am trying to remember the author, so I remember reading during college, journalism covers the result of the battle. Online journalism covers the shooting. This was at the beginning when we were starting to study online journalism. And I remember this while you were talking about the drafts. So it was only a draft. And in this moment we're living in, this moment of misinformation and the need for integrity in information, how do you balance the desire to have a scoop? Sometimes the information is correct, but it's not helpful. How do you prevent information also from hindering the process? I think that's an important question that we have to ask ourselves. We can't be utilitarian when it comes to journalism. I'm going to write this article with the goal of mobilizing this and that. You can't calculate the response to your article. But at the same time, you have to have the responsibility of understanding that maybe the news, maybe the story may be more of public interest while it's still being debated. And this is something I discuss all the time in regards to COP, in regards to diplomatic negotiations, because there's this vision in journalism that you only write about something that has reached its conclusion. But I like to imagine that I'm writing not to readers who don't participate in reality. I like to think that I'm informing those who do participate in reality. And it makes a difference to have a COP happening in a democratic country, as Claudio said, because the journalist is a mediator between what happens in the negotiation area and what happens outside. And when I look at the stories that I wrote after copy, I say, well, they weren't very helpful. But during that week, to have that pressure, I think it's very important. Even the Dubai negotiations, it, you know, in a authoritarian government, they were very worried about the repercussions. They had a draft where the most important sentence, which was about fossil fuels, it was edited last minute, and then there was this mobilization in the global press, which put a lot of pressure, and that made it possible for that sentence to be improved. So a phrase was decided on that helped advance. The progress is always small, but it's significant in the sense that it creates a minimum commitment that um, you can then monitor. And I think it's important for us to inform people as the process is developing. Alice, I wanted to hear from you. We have all these channels happening at the same time. Garrick from Armenia, he asked about English newsletters and podcasts. Um, Carol and Claudio, if you have other recommendations, feel free. And anyone, feel free to put recommendations in the chat and we can compile this and send it in the newsletter. I confess that I focus more on Brazil because these ones I recommended, they talk about the global scenario but focus on Brazil. But there are two that I put in the English chat that I follow for two reasons. One of them is the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. It's a newsletter that's very, I wouldn't say technical, but it's very detailed. And all of these conferences that happen throughout the year, the Bonn conference, some conferences we don't even know, all of these negotiations, these environmental negotiations, uh, are always listed there. And they create a bulletin of everything that's happening, and they provide summaries and details. And so it helps when you don't have time to read about what each diplomat said. This world of negotiations, diplomatic negotiations, is kind of different for us. There is a different agenda, but it's all connected. So sometimes the plastics treaty meeting was a failure, and that made us think, is it going to impact COP because things impact each other. And another recommendation I have is a newsletter called Nature Beat. It talks about nature in general, oceans, climate, everything and anything that's relevant regarding climate, including conferences, news articles. So unlike the first one that I recommend, it has a simpler language and gives you updates on different topics. One more question, and then we'll pass on to Claudio. You've been How do we talk about climate without being a a journalist that only reproduces quotes from leaders? There are all these authorities that want visibility. So when you cover pop, how do you stop yourself from just reproducing quotes from authorities? You need to s s if you need to know your focus. If your focus is maybe you work for an online portal, you end up doing that because if Lula says something, you have to publish it immediately, otherwise your competitor will do that. I have the privilege of writing articles that are a little more in-depth, even when they focus on conferences. So a few things make a difference. First, prior research, because even though conferences bring surprises, we sort of know what the themes are, and so you can prepare yourself in advance, minimally. And another thing that I think is crucial, regardless of your focus, is to have reliable sources because these topics are very complex, especially if you're inexperienced. It's difficult to understand, and so it makes a difference if the text is going to have should or must, because it does make a difference, and if you're not used to it, you might miss out. So have reliable sources that you can talk to at the end of the day and ask, "What happened?" Because we don't have access to a lot of things as press. So talk to people who do have access and who can be your sources. That's going to help you see beyond the quotes that you get in press conferences. Now I'm gonna ask Claudio and Carol, Alice as well, and then we're gonna head to the end. Check out the chat. People are recommending resources. So talking a little bit about what you do at Central da Copy, those who follow soccer knows that the sports press who goes to the stadiums is competes with the outlets from the sports clubs. And there's often this discussion between the traditional press competing, sometimes even for physical space, with these other outlets. And civil society also has its channels and its influencers. So is there really this competition? Can we work together? How is this relationship? Sometimes civil society has its own channels because they want engagement. I think it's worth discussing it. I am biased because after I became civil society, I went to some talks wearing this Echo badge. Echo is a news portal. For some time, we did the climate coverage for Echo. We have a column in Google, and we collaborate with a number of podcasts, including Entrando no Clima, and I actually asked them for help in getting credentials. And so now that I gave that disclaimer, I think that civil society has an agenda. Frequently, it's the same agenda as that of the conference. That's what we like to think anyway. But it's always going to be a tense relationship. Civil society is not the press. We may follow, we follow, they might follow some principles of journalism, but they're not journalists. They might hear the other side, but it's not in the same way. And so the press works differently and has to work differently. It's been healthy, but you need to understand what the boundaries are. And just like in the relationship with the government and the press, the government and civil society, the government loves to think that the press and civil society exist to praise it. And that's not how it works. We've suffered because of not praising the government. And now I'm going to ask Carol. I think there are great partners, sometimes in remote locations you don't have access to. What worries me is press conferences where you have activists who might cause somebody to just leave a press conference, end it. This happens in sports all the time. Some guy in the audience will irritate the spokesperson and they'll end the press conference. And that is why press conferences are restricted to journalists to avoid that type of thing. In our conversation, you talked about the importance of cultivating sources, including observers who can talk about what you negotiate, observers, documents, drafts, our responsibility to analyze all these pieces of the puzzle and solve it. But I've relied a lot on off the record statements. Of course, on the record statements are important so we know where the information came from precisely, but especially in moments when negotiation is very uncertain, the observer is requesting something, and sometimes understanding what is hindering the negotiations is something you find out off the record. And sometimes you are closer to the negotiator of your country who tells you a story, and you don't know what's happening in the mind of the other country. And it takes some time to to gain people's trust. And so in the first moment, go to the press conferences, go to the European Union press conference to slowly get closer so you can get these off the record statements. For example, the Chinese. Last year was the first time I was able to speak to them off the record because they're so reserved. And so it's an steady effort of trying to gain people's trust. Perfect. I'm going to um, head to the conclusion because I believe I'm making the interpreters upset. Do you have any final tips or recommendations? What do you expect, and what do you expect from the negotiations in this COP? I think my advice would be this is for those who are going for the first time. Don't get too excited and don't be too focused on your love of where you come from. Be careful, be a journalist, don't cover your eyes, your ears, your mouth. You're not there just to cover the governor's agenda. Step out of your comfort zone. This is the time to do it. Of course, as I said, you you have to have a plan of what you want to cover, but walk around. It's nice to have at least one free day where you can just get to know the place. The first COP I went to, it took me 2 hours to get to where I needed to go. I got lost. And then I was in the Brazil pavilion the whole time. And then when we finally got a chance to circulate, then that that's when I came up with ideas that led to stories after COP. So don't restrict yourself to your plan, your initial plan. And in terms of negotiation, that's a hard question, but I hope that we have some sort of statement about fossil fuels, even though that's improbable. Improbable. Perfect. Thank you, Alice. Claudio, Juliana asked, you talked about the green zone. You do need a credential, no? No, it's free access? Okay. Any final tips and expectations? Be optimistic, Claudio. Everything's gonna work out. Oh, you're breaking my legs. Asking for Claudio to be optimistic is impossible. What are you hoping doesn't happen? A complete logistics collapse. If that doesn't happen, then we're good. I'm very concerned about prices, about people giving up, and this just embarrassing Brazil because those who are in charge of logistics in copy, they are the most incompetent people ever. They should not be in charge of logistics anywhere, let alone a UN conference. It's not just a matter of comfort. If the delegations don't show up or are underrepresented, you have two scenarios. One is a negotiation that drags on because this person's colleague didn't show up and he has to head to another panel. And then the second thing that might happen is you don't have enough quorum to vote on something. So that's a risk, a real risk right now. Things happen, miracles also happen, but the scenario to where we can see is the potential for a logistic nightmare. I can say this that with certainty, this is unprecedented. My expectations, like Alice, is just something that signals uh, progress in terms of fossil fuels. That's it. Anna, you talked about preparation. Uh, Ricardo, in a previous event, he gave a tip that I thought was really good. Choose those you want to speak to, identify those you want to speak to so that you already know who to go after, and put a face to a name. So print out people's faces next to their names, and then you can identify those you want to speak to more easily. I have that on my phone, and I think it's super helpful. So, Carol, do you have any final tips? I think it's our duty as journalists to not do what government media does. We have an environment created locally. People weren't informed about those who were coming, and now that the problem hit the fan, we need to be very careful to understand that there's prejudice, but criticism is important. The biggest offense of the government is when people buy the idea that we criticize for the sake of criticizing. Carol, any suggestions for this COP, and what are your expectations? I support what you said. It's important to have some progress in terms of fossil fuels. Carol was having internet problems, and I think she is punishing me because I took too long to pass over to her. It's her own fault for complimenting Elon Musk. Let me remove her. Well, I think that's it. Oh, I think she's back. No, she didn't. Claudio, Alice, thank you so much for your time. I know that you are super busy right now. I want to thank you all for attending. Thank you, Knight Center, Ambiente e Sociedade, Itaú Foundation, and it's important for us to connect. And my final tip is to collaborate more, less competition between outlets and journalists. Let's work together. Let's mutually respect each other and let's get go after what we want. To do an event like we're doing today, involving so many organizations, it just shows how collaboration is important. For us, it's such an enriching experience, and to do it from Belém, I think there's lots of goodwill, and the effort is for us to keep the Amazon in the spotlight, working together. I talk too much. Anyway, unfortunately, Carol wasn't able to make it, but thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Claudio, Alice. Thank you. Follow follow us on social media. See you next Wednesday. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.